All right, well, hello, folks. My name is Cameron Nixon, and today we're going to be talking about some hodographs. I want to thank the Tornado Titans, first and foremost, for their inspiration and the idea behind this video. And I want to thank everyone who's contributed just such amazing pictures that have really helped create an immersive experience for this. I grew into this field as a spotter, and one thing I'm sure we could all agree upon is that one of the most fascinating aspects of this hobby and field is just how many different shapes and sizes and personalities almost of supercells exist out there. And, we go out there every May thinking nature's just going to surprise us, or we sit down at our forecasting desk like, all right, what's the atmosphere got today? And one thing I want to hammer home in this video is that these are not surprises. These can be forecasted, especially using pattern recognition. And I kind of want to explore that for the better of both of our photographies or forecasts. So I want you to think about first, what makes a supercell photogenic to you? Are you looking for those striations? Are you looking for that mothership look like we got off on the right? Do you just love the really tilted, sheared off updrafts that happen in some environments? What about that like crisp, cold season November style look? LPs, are you a fan of those? Are you a fan of really massive supercells, really tiny supercells? I love me a good mini supercell, honestly. But what about sun angle? All of these things you probably have in the back of your mind if you've got a camera out. And using this to try to figure out how to best approach these storms. But also, what makes a supercell dangerous to spot? What about low bases that basically preclude you from seeing the tornado anywhere farther from a mile or so? What about rain wrapping? What about that dreaded stratus deck that covers up your storm? Strong RFD surges, size of the hail, the speed of the storm. What about storm behavioral functions like cycling or deviant motion of any tornadoes? I know this tornado right here was infamous for taking a deviant motion that surprised a lot of people. So what I want to first talk about is that skew T's and the thermodynamics play a huge role in fostering hazards, and what I like to say kind of reveal certain processes within the supercell or mask others. So what we got here, I like to call this the look, right? You see these low bases, scuddy, really convective looking. There's not much laminar forms here. And, your supercell might not be that pretty, but once you see this, you just kind of know. You just kind of know that, like, something could happen today. And this is this is just a generic looking sounding, right? You have a lot of cape near the ground, especially. And one thing that stands out is your LCL and your LFC are very close together. Anything that condenses is immediately going to rise freely, and that's why you just have cumulus as your cloud base. This also manifests itself in a higher base look. Even if your base is really high, if your LFC is right above that, you're still going to get this convective look. That's why Colorado does this in excess, and that's why you can still get really slender tubular tornadoes from these kind of storms, is because there's cape right above the condensation level. What is pretty much the most sought after, I'd think, for supercells at least, is actually what makes tornadoes hardest to get. This look, this kind of gentle, flowing, smooth, striated look. What you really need for this is not free convection, but forced convection. And how to get forced convection is having your LFC way above your LCL. This is probably about 2 kilometers worth. So anything that rises up and condenses needs to be forced and twisted and contorted into that supercell. And that's how you could physically see these shear processes going on here. And again, this is detrimental for tornadoes for sure. So that's often why these kind of structures in tornadoes really are not associated with each other. You could also get the higher base version of this. I like to call it pancake. Makes me a little bit hungry. But what all we did here was take the this 2 kilometer kind of LCL LFC and whoops, raise it up closer to this freezing line. One thing I've noticed is that this freezing line, the closer your structure is to the freezing line, the less structure you're actually going to get. So you basically cut off your structure at that freezing line. You tend to just get this murky gray or virga. Out in Colorado, that's why a lot of your storms are just these kind of flat cloud bases and then virga right above them. It's because you're higher elevation, you're closer to the freezing line. And that basically cuts off any cloud cumuliform structure. Um, so the only thing that you really do not want on a storm chase is this kind of look. Of course, this was the Mangum, Oklahoma day in 2019. And what we have here is just this really not steep, I'm searching for the right word, thermodynamic profile here, and just saturated for kilometers. And this saturation through that deep of a layer is A, going to ensure you have very low cloud bases, and B, just encourage the growth of these stratiform kind of stratus decks everywhere and kind of shield your view of these storms from far away. So this is what you do not want to go after. Worst comes to worst, yeah, but try to stay away from those. So what I obviously love talking about the most, though, is the hodograph. And just for a quick refresher, we're going to be dealing with these in the storm relative sense. So what am I doing? This is a normal hodograph right here. Your storm motion is right here. Your hodograph looks like this. All I'm doing is bringing that to the origin. That's all we're going to do today. So we're just bringing this little dot here to the origin. And I kind of left a arrow where the dot was, so you can kind of get a sense to where the storm is moving relative to that hodograph. So I want to begin with this rather interesting little flurry of tornadoes that occurred over the DFW Metro late in October this year. And what really was striking about this event was how visible this tornado was, especially for the time of year and the city and location it was in. And one of the easiest concepts on the hodograph to understand, the storm relative hodograph, is storm relative wind. And so let's say we're the storm at this red dot. And so let's look at our 6 kilometer point right here. We're rocking almost 30 knots of storm relative flow. That is the actual wind that the storm is experiencing coming from the southwest, blowing toward the northeast. And so at 8 kilometers, we have over 40 knots of storm relative flow. My little kind of danger zone for HP supercells threshold is this 20 knot mark. If we have a lot of storm relative flow, especially from 6 kilometers and above, within this little range ring here, you typically end up getting HP storms. Whereas if you have a lot of upper level flow, it can be really high up, 8 kilometers plus. But if you have a lot of storm relative flow outside of this 40 knot range ring, that is when you tend toward LP supercell structures, because you have a really strong ventilation of wind away from your updraft. So that's going to kind of uncover your tornado and ensure there's not going to get any rain in its way. And that's why half the city saw this tornado. Another really interesting event was this uncharacteristic early October Mothership. I'll blow this up. Alex Spann sent me in this one. And just gorgeous. And this is what you'd expect in May. This is what's supposed to happen in May, in October. So why did this happen? If I scroll back and forth between these two photographs, at first glance, untrained eye, especially if you're not looking at them in the storm relative sense, they look pretty similar, right? They have that big hump in the low levels, and then they have that really strong speed shear. And I use this example to kind of explain why there are a lot of subtleties that will lead to this difference between structures, and why this storm that Alex found was able to take on this look. So as a little reminder, let's take the hodograph from the DFW event. If you want to find out where your streamwise and crosswise vorticity is, draw your storm relative winds. I've just drawn one to near the surface, and then another to 2 kilometers, just for an example. And wherever your storm relative wind is perpendicular to your shear vector, that is your streamwise flow. That is your streamwise vorticity. Wherever your storm relative flow is parallel to your shear, that is going to be your crosswise vorticity. And what's interesting is that supercells seem to really like streamwise vorticity, even above 135 kilometers, in terms of taking on mothership like appearances. I don't know why this is, and I'm not going to claim to know, but this is just something that I've observed. So what happened here is that you had, your LCLs right here, so about probably zero point 0.5 to 1 kilometers, somewhere in that range. And you still had an additional 1 to almost even 3 kilometers worth of nearly streamwise flow, especially as you got up toward 3 kilometers. So what the supercell did, it really enjoyed that, and it was able to take on this mothership appearance. Whereas in our example for our DFW storm, as soon as you hit your LCL at this about 1 kilometer point, there was only crosswise vorticity above that. This 1 to 3 and this 3 to 6, this was all crosswise. So in those kind of environments, supercells rarely take up the structure that they do in this kind of streamwise flow environment. Another example that kind of illustrates this is this just jaw-dropping shot by Bruce Haney. And what's really interesting about this is if context and location were just taken out of place, this looks like a late November kind of event where you had these really crisp leaning towers. You really did not have any mothership look at all. And this is uncharacteristic of Western Kansas in mid-May, when you're supposed to be having these large mothership kind of looks. And this was made by a hodograph that also had nearly crosswise vorticity throughout a very large depth. And again, this is why I kind of said that thermodynamics will either like reveal or hide certain processes. Below this cloud level, there is lots of streamwise vorticity, and that's why we were able to get this tornado. However, everything that you could see within our cloud structure was actually crosswise, and that's why it kind of took on this look that's very unclassic. I also want to compare this to a picture that I took in Paducah, Texas a couple years back, and it's just an uncanny similarity. As you could guess, both photographs were identical. From 1 to probably 8 kilometers or so. They both had this V shape, V for veer back. And what ended up resulting is in both images, you could see the tower initially tends to kind of lean over to the right. And however, it ends up backing counterclockwise up into the atmosphere. You could see those knucklings where that air gets suppressed once it reaches the equilibrium level. And so both storms here exhibited that general backing with height, and it is just amazing that these both look so similar. I've noticed that these kind of weird V shapes will give you typically your Mamatis display, your back sheared anvil Mamatis display is behind your storm where you can't see it. But this kind of V shape will kind of unravel this around the storm, so they're more visible. So you're seeing your post-storm Mamatis display while you're in front of the storm. It's really weird, and these can kind of like mess with your head. But this is obviously what you would anticipate going into Kansas in mid-May, or at least hope to see, is this large mothership. This was a stationary event near Leote, so our bunker's motion was a little bit off here. However, this is what kind of hodograph you need for that, and as you could probably guess, think about where your storm relative wind vectors, and if this is crosswise or streamwise vorticity. And if you guess streamwise, then you are absolutely correct. These supercells love that, streamwise vorticity through a very deep layer. This sort of event, you also, my handy tip for this is you always want to be on the southern side of the storm, right? Because the hodograph, the storm relative winds are all blowing to the north and even a little bit east. So that is where all your rain is going to end up. So especially if you see this hodograph and think, ooh, motherships could be happening today because of all the streamwise vorticity, get the heck south. This is where, thankfully, every chaser ended up. But I know me too. I wasn't really anticipating this going in, and I ended up kind of in the forward flank here and was missing most of the show, unbeknownst to me. So once I came down, I was like, oh, wow. And this is where you want to be. You want to be trailing these storms from the south. So what does this hodograph do? This is an absurd amount of storm relative flow, almost 30 knots from 1 to even 8 kilometers, and this is all Streamwise. So this is just knock your socks off, like almost the perfect hodograph, if you will, for mothershipping, as I call it. So what resulted here, John Rich from Tornado Action West was able to show us this is just a beautiful super. I can't even eat this many pancakes in one meal. There's this one, two, three, four, five. Oops, and this is just what supercells tend to do in streamwise flow through a deep layer. Again, I don't know how streamwise flow, especially in the upper levels, is relevant, but it ends up having this effect time and time again. So another weird instance, this photograph looks like a 2. And these might throw you for a loop and by surprise. But this actually occurred in the around midnight or early morning near the DFW Metro. And you wouldn't really typically think Mothership by looking at this 2-shaped photograph. But if I flip back and forth, they both feature that same large concave kind of hole to them in the low levels. And this little thing here is because it's elevated. So like the cloud base doesn't even start, or the inflow layer doesn't even start until probably 0.51 kilometers. So this is all that really matters in this case. So even though you don't have a perfect circle, this is what is going to give you that mothership look. Another unclassic way to get some mothershipping is with this kind of hodograph here. And what this is actually is a cold frontal sounding. This was actually taken on May 27th, 2017 during I believe it was a moderate risk or something, where everyone was in central Oklahoma looking for a tornado threat, while Alex Sheath was located in the Oklahoma Panhandle grabbing this. And what this is you get a little bit of backing near the ground from the cold front coming in, and then you still have a lot of veering up into the upper levels, and this gives you some pretty solid supercell structures. And what's weird about this one, and actually pleasantly good, is that your storm is moving out away from the hodograph. So that means that all your precipitation, if you're watching the storm, is shoved way behind the storm. So you don't have to worry about anything getting in the way between you and the business end of the supercell. So you could just sit here and watch it and time lapse it like Alex did. Just a really impressive storm. And again, the business end, everything that you want to see is just headed straight for you. So it's really easy and simple to spot. So we could switch gears a little bit and talk about some mini supercells. This was a warm season, I like to call them, mini supercell environment in Indiana for the Indiana and Ohio surprise tornado outbreak. And these are basically, anytime you get a warm season mini supercell, they tend to be very tiny hodographs. And there's been a lot of research that basically hints at the possibility that smaller hodographs just yield smaller supercells. And that's what tends to occur. These are cute little baby supercells, and sometimes no more than just like a glorified rain shower, even though they possess all the structural characteristics of normal supercells. Um, and you can even get this. I saw this one in Selden, Kansas in 2015. And starting out, the hodographs were actually quite small. And so you got kind of quaint supercell structures. And oftentimes there might not be hardly any shear above, this is 3 kilometers. There's really not much, if any, shear above that level. So you don't really get like dramatic supercell structures. You kind of just get an updraft column. And like these might look really cool, but like convectively they're quite boring. There's just a little bit of rotation at the ground, and then just an updraft above that. So yeah, these do not tend to be the strongest supercells, even though they can produce tornadoes. So what I've found really interesting, though, is this sort of hodograph that's pretty much identical in character to what we just talked about. If you jack it up with lots and lots and lots of cape, you tend to get some bizarre things happening. This was actually the Joplin tornado sounding. And what I've noticed is that with these hodographs, you tend to get very quick organization of storms into supercells, regardless how there's really not that much shear. If you have a rounded hodograph that displays mainly streamwise vorticity, you might have some blobular HP merging going on, or consecutive storms going up into one. But once that merging stops, like, you have one storm that takes over and either produces very large tornadoes or produces like a flurry of them cyclically. This is what happened with the Dimmitt, Texas tornado. You had a series of mergers just combine in like very rapidly into a pretty strong supercell, even given just this very quaint, like, small hodograph. Um, Another event that kind of ticked me off was May 1st of this year, 2019. I basically rode off Target just a couple hours from home because I thought the photographs were too small. They were perfectly round, though. I just thought they were too small. We also had a lot of Cape that day, and what happened? Storms instantly were supercells upon birth, pretty much. So it's just really wild. I guess my takeaway here is never underestimate even small photographs if they are curved. To contrast that, this is the kind of cold season variety of mini supercell. You have sometimes a pretty small hump in the low levels, just like the past cases, but you do have some usually backed, strongly sheared flow above that. And what's cool about this is that most of your precipitation falls between kind of your like 1 and 8 kilometers, say, level, because that is where your storm relative winds are that are pushing your rain outward. And what usually ends up occurring is that these storm relative winds encompass only a small sliver of a quadrant of this hodograph. So all the rain falls in this small, skinny kind of triangle, and what that does is really reveal a lot of the tornadic activity. So it's really quick and painless to watch. This was the Eads, Colorado tornado shot by Ben. Just like these tornadoes are something out of a dream. This is a radar image, and this is the sounding from actually the December 1st, 2018 tornado outbreak in Illinois. And lo and behold, the tornadoes from that day looked very similar to this. And it's just uncanny. A lot of these events, one occurred in Kansas in late May this year as well. And there's this very highly photogenic tornadoes because there is hardly any rain around them, and they are mini supercells. And like another hallmark of these is that you could see these tornadoes, just like Ben's, from behind the supercell. And often these just come as a surprise because there's not a lot of structure sometimes to warn you that there is about to be a tornado. So what happens if you juice this up a little bit? This is we basically just kind of extended this photograph a little bit. And this is where you get some truly remarkable tornadoes. There is a lot of storm relative flow in the low levels this time, approaching almost 40 knots here. And this tends to sometimes encourage longer tracked, more steady state tornadoes. And combined with some very strong storm relative flow in the upper levels, this pretty much hits all bases. And you just get, at times, very large tornadoes that are easily revealed because there is such strong storm relative flow approaching that LP threshold. And so even looking at this radar image, like, this is the kind of storm that if you're sitting here, like, you could rest assured, like, this is coming your way, and there's really not going to be much precipitation in your way. You could pretty much see it from a distance. And if you want that tilted tower look and I guess a starry night sky above that, this was just an amazing event. But others have occurred like this. The April 14, 2012 outbreak, this tornado, this LongTrack tornado near Salina, Kansas, also was birthed under a very similar hodograph, lo and behold. So to contrast that, we could take, I'll just flip back and forth. We didn't really change the low levels that much. That 0 to 3 kilometer point looks pretty much the same. However, we took this really strong storm relative flow and smashed it into that sub 20 meters per second, or 20 knot range ring. And that's again my danger zone for HP storms. And so we have from 1.5 kilometers all the way up to pretty much the top of the hodograph, all settled in this almost borderline quiescent storm relative flow here. And what happens is you just get dumps of rain and hail in your storm, and making for extremely dangerous spotting conditions. And I'm not going to reiterate things that happened on this day, but this is a prime example of why you should be watching your storm relative flows and anticipating what kinds of supercell structures that could exist before you go after them. So, and this is kind of what this looks like on radar, just a big blob with an EF4 tornado inside that not that many people could see. Another way that you can get difficult to spot storms, even with strong shear, is by looping this hodograph around where your storm is moving. Remember our other case, we had the storm moving out of the hodograph. In most of our cases, the storm moves kind of along your hodograph. In this case, the storm is moving through your hodograph. The hodograph is wrapping around it. Well, if the hodograph wraps around it, the rain also wraps around it, and this is how you get rain-wrapped mesocyclones. These storms were headed mostly with kind of like a southeasterly component, probably this way. So if you wanted to spot these storms, you'd probably want to set up right here. Well, guess what? It is raining there, and it will be raining there until your tornado comes barreling down on you, and it is really hard to get inside and see it. And that's why I kind of like this kind of storm is what coins the term the notch, because you need to get up inside that notch and you need to stay there in order to see it. My buddy was able to do so, Will White, and he was able to spot this tornado, but it is just very hard. It takes a lot of skill and experience to see something like this, because you're at the mercy of being blindfolded until it comes closer to you. There are other factors, though, besides simply rain wrapping that can lead to some pretty hazardous, even dangerous storms to spot. This was the infamous 2013 Cleburne, Texas tornado. And the storm initially is moving due southeast until the tornado decides to make this sudden erratic left turn toward the city of Cleburne. And I'm using these bunny ears because what I'm figuring out is that this sort of deviant motion is actually pretty predictable using the hodograph, surprisingly. And what happens here is that when you have weaker storm relative, or when you have weaker flow in general, in the upper levels, you have less to steer your mesocyclone and all of its parts in one predictable direction. That is why a lot of our really fast-moving storms are pretty easily predictable from very far distances away, and they tend to not really surprise us in terms of mesocyclone motion. However, when you have a nearly stationary storm, the effect of all of its moving pieces is amplified because they have nowhere else to go. And all of these storm relative processes are take on different directions from the stationary storm. They do this even in quick storm motions, but the relative change in direction when they occur is a lot less. And this is a really difficult process to explain, but what to look out for when this does happen is these very large, low-level pieces of your hodograph and a storm motion that is nearly stationary or almost due away from this portion here, this hump. And what happens is your storm or your tornado, once it occludes, is sort of attracted to these low levels, especially when you have very large curvature here. So you could have a storm that in this case was moving almost due south, and it be attracted to this part of the hodograph that is due north of it. And what happens then is that you have the southward storm motion and then northward moving tornado. Other cases, this is a very amplified version of this. This was in Alta Vista, Kansas, in August earlier this year. And all of your flow, pretty much 100% of your hodograph, is from 0 to 3 kilometers. And again, you have a storm motion that opposes this very large level hump. So all your mesocyclone effects take on different directions pretty much. Your storm is moving. You could see this couplet was moving to the southeast with bunkers. However, there were a couple low-level mesocyclones that quickly spun off to the north. This is a very scary storm to spot if you're somewhere within the storm at all. So definitely take these with caution as well. And sometimes storms can take on a sort of cyclical motion to them. This is, I like to call this one the serial cyclic, because it gets the job done very quickly and multiple times. This was the event that we were actually talking about earlier in the DFW Metro. At times, there are almost 3 circulations occurring within the storm at once. They tend to take on this kind of awkward, really closed or sharp, acute angle here, I guess you could say, with the hook. And what tends to occur is that these things just let out a barrage of usually shorter lived, weaker tornadoes, although there have been exceptions. And these tornadoes, as we were talking about earlier, they take deviant motions that are attracted by these really large low level hodographs. So you end up having this one solid supercell track with tornadoes that just jut out of it like this. This was an example of one that happened in San Angelo earlier this year. You can see they perpetually shed new hook echoes down here as each tornado kind of occludes to the north. So this one will occlude to the north, and then another hook echo would form after that that leads to the next tornado. So it's a progression of tornadoes. They really do not stop. It is just constantly cycling when you have kind of a general hodograph shape that looks like this in the storm relative sense. Another way storms cycle is through this kind of like carouseling method, I like to call it. And whenever you get these really large, smooth hodographs, you can either be dominated by mid-level shear like this one was near Cheyenne in 2017, or you can be kind of low-level dominated as well. As long as you have this really gentle, curved shape to your hodograph, you end up getting the storm that just produces tornadoes in kind of a more predictable cyclic fashion. And what I mean by that is you kind of have this like one after another after another. It's a very slow, deliberate kind of process. And these mesocyclones, sometimes you'll have a leading mesocyclone. This one's actually a decoy on this day. There weren't really any tornadoes that formed under this. They would form right when they passed behind it through to the rear of the storm. There's a couple funnel clouds and then a wall cloud that ended up producing a tornado minutes later. So you just have this kind of gentle cycle of kind of like a pocket of vorticity, I guess, from the main mesocyclone toward the rear of the storm. It's just perpetually moving, one after another after another. And these tracks were from the Capital Montana Day in late June of 2018. And you could see that they all, it's a more broad scale supercell process. This gentle shuffling of mesocyclones. So they take on a gentle shuffling kind of look to them once you survey the damage tracks. And this was the El Reno tornado of 2013. And the dangerous part about this kind of carouseling action is that it can be very broad sweeping, I like to say. This was the supercell before it produced, and it just let out this very large U shape before even attempting to do that same thing again. So these are very predictable. They will do the same thing time and again. But you need to kind of let them, give them some space in order to do this. And many people obviously did not do that on this day. How do you get 2 tornadoes at once then? This is kind of an interesting case. This was the Pilger, Nebraska day, obviously. And what I've noticed is that whenever your hodograph is very perfectly circular, you heighten your chance of getting 2 tornadoes, especially 2 tornadoes that last for longer periods of time. So what occurred on this day is that you had one tornado and then another one that very quickly formed right after it. And they're kind of allowed to just like sit and stew in the mesocyclone for a while and then interact with each other in kind of strange ways. You can see this kind of radar loop I grabbed from US Tornadoes. And what ends up happening, this was the first tornado, and then the second 2 formed in quick succession. And they're kind of allowed to hang in that mesocyclone for a long time and then even do like a little kind of Fujiwara dance as they neared the end of their life cycle, ending up in some pretty weird tracks here. And the Dodge City Day in Kansas in 2016 was also a prime example of this kind of hodograph, and this was able to support 2 tornadoes at once for pretty long periods of time. And as you can see, the easiest way to spot these are actually a breeze to spot as well, because they just move to the north. And these tornadoes also tend to occlude to the north as well. So there's really not a whole lot of parts of this mesocyclone that kind of go south to scare you. So what you got to do is just stay right at the base of this kind of storm and just follow it due north. Joey Crassel sent me this amazing view of the Pilger twins, and as you can see, he was just sitting pretty due south. They're doing nothing to harm him. He just had to come up from the south and just view them right there next to each other, and just an amazing sight. So in contrast to our Pilger day then, which had a very large circular hodograph that housed two mesocyclones underneath it for long periods of time, we have this day. This is November 17th of 2013 in Illinois. This is a high-risk day. And this was a fairly straight hodograph, and it had a fairly insignificant low-level hump compared to the rest of your hodograph. And what I've seen from these most often is that you have a mesocyclone that basically stays put under that supercell without doing any weird deviations or cycling motions. Your storm just simply sustains one mesocyclone for long periods of time. And what that does is allow the storm to carry tornadoes for very long periods of time too. So you just get long-lived, longer-track tornadoes from this kind of sounding. And this is exactly what occurred on the Washington, Illinois day. And, if you're forecasting for this, the only silver lining, I guess, that you could have during a day like today is that these tornadoes do not jump around out of their warning boxes. So you can feel free to produce a longer warning box and have faith that your storm is going to go straight through that like an arrow. They're very straightforward. This is the kind of structure that you typically see with these. This is actually a day from Tahoka, Texas in May, but it was also a straight hodograph, and it displayed many of the features that I tend to see with this kind of like bullet structure that I just talked about. And they typically end up being very linear looking, often pointy too. This is like a really long inflow tail and an SVC right here. So to the untrained eye, it's pretty difficult to discern where your tornado is going to end up. It ended up right here at this little kind of U shape, and like the bulk of the storm ends up being inflow. But again, it's just like you look at this and it's hard to kind of immediately tell the storm is rotating. There's not many tells like we had with the Mothership storms. But we do have all these features, this inflow tail, this RFD, to ensure that you know that it is a supercell. This is how you get surprise long-track tornadoes. This was the Chapman, Kansas day in 2016. And again, you have a hodograph structure. These look very different if I go back and forth. However, in both cases, your low-level hump is really insignificant compared to the rest of your hodograph, and you have very strong speed shear between 1 and 9 kilometers or so. And this ends up also producing supercells that have longer tracked mesocyclones or longer lived mesocyclones, because there is not a lot in the way of these large low level humps that end up making for erratic motions within it, or rapid occlusions and deviant motions of any tornadoes that it houses. So this supercell was able to just kind of hold that mesocyclone for 90 minutes as it produced this long track EF4. And my guess is that these longer lived tornadoes are more apt to be strong to violent, especially stronger than you anticipated with that kind of environment. The Rochelle tornado of 2015 was also a poster child for this kind of hodograph. So coincidence? I'm not sure. So the question remains then, is there a perfect in the world of hodographs? And, I don't know the answer to that, but you can always look at past events that have produced very long-lived violent tornadoes. This was the April 27, 2011 day, outbreak of a generation, and you had a hodograph that basically kind of ties between the couple hodographs that we've been looking at recently that have this very strong mid and upper level flow and veering that could perhaps lead to some pretty robust long-lived supercell mechanics, as well as having almost a straight appearance as well, with very strong low-level near surface flow approaching 50 knots. So it's my guess that this kind of hodograph somehow was able to produce both that really robust mid-upper level supercell structure, as well as allow the configuration for a single steady-state mesocyclone for very long periods of time. And as you can see, this tornado is very far removed from any of the precipitation in the supercell, with all that strong storm relative flow and that shear from the ground level. So this supercell was able to keep this tornado and hold it away from its precipitation for hours. And this is not just the supercell, though. This is at pretty much every supercell that occurred here. Like, you didn't see on this day just a random supercell that decided to just rapidly cycle between mesocyclones. That didn't happen. This is why I truly firmly believe that the hodograph has this type of jurisdiction over what happens on the ground. So with that, I thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, comments, insights, how has this helped you? I want to know. How has any sort of looking at hodograph structure helped you in your spotting game, in your forecasting game? Please feel free to tell me, because I'm learning every single day, and there are things in here that I probably haven't even picked up on, and there are many things here that we still have yet to discover. So with that, I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching.